I am off on a sea voyage. It is to get the world and the devil out of my head, so that I can start fresh at the farm in June. The first actual pleasure trip I ever had. The Reverend said he would go too, a good man, one of the best of men, although a clergyman. We took the New York boat from New Haven to New York. I gobbled a youth's place in line and was proud of my manly assertion of my rights. When he yielded and looked so meek and abashed, I felt infinitely ashamed of myself. I did not get through blushing for an hour. People were sitting around the saloon waiting for beds and looking forlorn. After a while I went to my stateroom and undressed, but the night was too enticing for bed. We were moving down the bay now, and it was pleasant to stand at the window and take the cool night breeze and watch the gliding lights on shore. Near midnight, far away, lightning flashing, paling the scattered red lights, then a distant thunder. Come morning, Twichell was on the main deck and asked a mulatto stewardess a question not in her line. Oh, the scorn she threw into the fact that it was out of her line. Twichell asked 5 people where the baggage room on the dock was. One was enough. Then he wanted to go there and see if our trunks were there, as if our checks weren't sufficient. We started uptown. Twichell to policeman 1, 2, 3, suspicious of overcoat and green manners. Can you tell me where Pier 12 is? We didn't need to know where it was yet. Policeman. Pier 12, East River? Twichell. No, Pier 12, North River. Policeman suspiciously eyeing Twichell from head to foot. This is East River, watching for effect. Twichell. Oh, with an air of one who has much to suggest he hadn't thought of that, and yet with a manner that would lead one to suspect that he was ignorant that there was an East River, and therefore couldn't have thought of it. Policeman. Pier 12, North River, is on the other side of town. You can go there by car, but Twichell interrupting. We only wanted to know, you know. We don't want to go there. We Policeman very suspiciously. You don't want to go there? Twichell. No, that is not now, not just now. But if we knew the way. Policeman. Do you know Old Trinity Church? Twichell with uncertainty. Oh, yes. Policeman. Well, you strike down the first street before you come to Trinity, and that will take you there. Twichell going. Thanks, many thanks. Now, we didn't need to ask those questions. We have caused that man to suspect us. Where we are really bound for is William Street near Fulton. Come along now, and let's not ask any more questions until we want to find out something. By this time we had gone a block, and then we turned in the wrong direction and walked a blazing hot 300 yards before observing it. Twichell. Didn't you say William near Fulton? Yes, and if you hadn't stopped to fool with that policeman, we would be there by this time instead of plowing along in this fiery weather. Twichell. Well, I only wanted to ask. Yes, you're always wanting to ask. That's the trouble. Twichell. Well, I don't mean any harm by it. I want to ask this man here if what? Twichell. If we were going in the right direction. You don't need to ask him. I know all about it. Twichell to a fellow sweeping sidewalk. "My friend, are we going right to strike Fulton Street?" Man. "No, you are going right away from it." The man was right. I saw it in a moment. So we turned, and Twichell asked the direction every now and then, and I was tongue-tied and had to let him go on. Presently we observed that policeman 123 was following us. He talked to a man in plain clothes, then disappeared, and so did the plain clothes man, to slip on a false mustache. And after that we had the pleasant conviction that we were being shadowed. The overcoat and the early hour brought us under suspicion at the restaurant. The large and solitary waiter on the second floor kept his ancient mariner eye steadily and accusingly on us while our breakfast cooked. It was uncomfortable. I began to talk of men and things likely to give him an idea of our respectability, and was humiliated to notice that he was not believing in my men and things. I went on in a sort of desperate way, telling matters that occurred between myself and distinguished people, the waiter's unbelief coldly growing. I desperately increased and enlarged my men, and in such a way as to show that that intercourse was the familiar intercourse with exceedingly great men, and in such a way as to show that that intercourse was the familiar intercourse of old friends. It was a failure. The waiter was implacable. I saw that his original doubts and suspicions of me were becoming petrified certainties. And now I had a happy thought. Luckily, my comrade was a clergyman. That would be respectable enough company to satisfy even such a purist as this waiter. So I said to my friend, keeping a furtive eye on the waiter to observe effect, "When you were preaching the morning sermon last Sunday—" The waiter turned away with the indignant look of one who had received the last feather and could carry no more in the way of shameless humbug. Then I noticed Twichell didn't look clerical. How grateful I was when an old customer of the place came in, recognized me with effusion, and gave me an opportunity to introduce my friend, the Reverend Mr. What a sense of victory I had! What a triumph it was to look into that waiter's face and see him mutely taking back all the injurious things he had been saying to himself about us. Policeman still on our track. I stopped in a shop and bought a deck of cards. Toward the middle of the afternoon we arrived on board the stanch steamship Bermuda with bag and baggage, and hunted for a shady place. It was blazing summer weather until we were halfway down the harbor. Then I buttoned my coat closely. Half an hour later I put on a spring overcoat and buttoned that, and as we passed the lightship I added an holster and tied a handkerchief around the collar to hold it snug to my neck. So rapidly had the summer gone and winter come again. Thursday, 3:30 p.m. Underway. Passing the battery. A large party of 4 married couples, 3 bachelors, and a cheery, exhilarating doctor from the wilds of Pennsylvania are evidently traveling together, all but the doctor grouped in camp chairs on deck. Passing Principal Fort. The doctor is one of those people who has an infallible preventive of seasickness, is flitting from friend to friend, administering it, and saying, "Don't you be afraid. I know this medicine. Absolutely infallible. prepared under my own supervision. Takes a dose himself intrepidly. 4:15 p.m. Two of those ladies have struck their colors, notwithstanding the infallible. They have gone below. The other two begin to show distress. 5 p.m. Exit one husband and one bachelor. These still have their infallible in cargo when they started, but arrived at the companionway without it. 5:10, lady number 3, two bachelors, and one married man have gone below with their own opinion of the infallible. 5:20, passing quarantine hulk. The infallible has done the business for all the party except the Scotchman's wife and the author of that formidable remedy. Nearing the lightship, exit the Scotchman's wife, head drooped on stewardess's shoulder. Entering the open sea, exit doctor. By nightfall we were far out at sea with no land in sight. No telegrams could come here, no letters, no news. This was an uplifting thought. It was still more uplifting to reflect that the millions of harassed people on shore behind us were suffering just as usual. A hearty supper at 6, chat in smoking room till 8, then whiskey and to bed. Kept waking up with nightmares all night. Coffee for supper. Finally fell to reading at 2 or 3 and read till sunrise. The next day brought us into the midst of the Atlantic solitudes, out of smoke-colored sounding into fathomless deep blue. No ships visible anywhere over the wide ocean. No company but Mother Carey's chickens, wheeling, darting, skimming the waves in the sun. Very beautiful, bronze, shiny and metallic, broad white stripe across tail. Built and carry themselves much like swallows. After luncheon I commenced feeding crumbs to a few over the stern, and in 15 minutes had 1,000 collected from nobody knows where. After a smoke and a promenade on deck, where is no motion to discompose our steps, we think of a game of whist. We ask the brisk and capable stewardess from Ireland if there are any cards in the ship. "Bless your soul, dear, indeed there is. Not a whole pack, true, for ye, but not enough missing to signify." However, I happened to bethink me of a new pack in the morocco case in my trunk, which I had placed there by mistake, thinking it to be a flask of something. So a party of us conquered the tedium of the evening with a few games, and were ready for bed at 6 bells, mariner's time, the signal for putting out the lights. At 8 o'clock on the third morning out from New York, land was sighted. Away across the sunny waves, one saw a faint, dark stripe stretched along under the horizon, or pretended to see it, for the credit of his eyesight. Even the Reverend said he saw it, a thing which is manifestly not so, but I have never seen anyone who was morally strong enough to confess that he could not see land when others claimed that they could. By and by the Bermuda Islands were easily visible. The principal one lay upon the water in the distance, a long, dull-colored body, scalloped with slight hills and valleys. We could not go straight at it, but had to travel all the way around it, 16 miles from shore, because it is fenced with an invisible coral reef. At last we sighted buoys bobbing here and there, and then we glided into a narrow channel among them, raised the reef, and came upon shoaling blue water that soon further shoaled into pale green, with a surface scarcely rippled. Now came the resurrection hour. The births gave up their dead. Who are these pale specters in plug hats and silken flounces that file up the companionway in melancholy procession and step upon the deck? These are they which took the infallible preventive of seasickness in New York harbor and then disappeared and were forgotten. Also, there came 2 or 3 faces not seen before until this moment. One's impulse is to ask, "Where did you come aboard?" We followed the narrow channel a long time, with land on both sides, low hills that might have been green and grassy, but had a faded look instead. However, the landlocked water was lovely at any rate, with its glittering belts of blue and green where moderate soundings were, and its broad splotches of rich brown where the rocks lay near the surface. At last we steamed between 2 island points whose rocky jaws allowed only just enough room for the vessel's body, and now before us loomed Hamilton, on her clustered hillsides and summits, the whitest mass of terraced architecture that exists in the world, perhaps. It was a Sunday afternoon, and on the pier were gathered 100 or 200 Bermudians, half of them black, half of them white, and all of them novelly dressed, as the poet says. Several boats came off to the ship, bringing citizens. One of these citizens was a faded, diminutive old gentleman who approached our most ancient passenger with a childlike joy in his twinkling eyes, halted before him, folded his arms, and said, smiling with all his might and with all the simple delight that was in him, "You don't know me, John. Come out with it now. You know you don't." The ancient passenger scanned him perplexedly, scanned the napless, threadbare costume of venerable fashion that had done Sunday service no man knows how many years, contemplated the marvelous stovepipe hat of still more ancient and venerable pattern, with its poor, pathetic old stiff brim canted up gallously in the wrong places, and said with a hesitation that indicated strong internal effort to place the gentle old apparition, "Why, let me see. Plague on it, there's something about you that but I've been gone from Bermuda for 27 years, and I don't seem to get at it somehow, but there's something about you that is just as familiar to me as—" "Likely it might be his hat," murmured the ass, with innocent, sympathetic interest. So the Reverend and I had at last arrived at Hamilton, the principal town in the Bermuda Islands, a wonderfully white town, white as snow itself, white as marble, white as flour, yet looking like none of these exactly. "Never mind," we said, "we shall hit upon a figure by and by that will describe this peculiar white." There was an ample pier of heavy masonry. Upon this, under shelter, were some thousands of barrels containing that product which has carried the fame of Bermuda to many lands, the potato, and here and there an onion. That last sentence is facetious, for they grow at least 2 onions in Bermuda to 1 potato. The onion is the pride and joy of Bermuda. It is her jewel, her gem of gems. In her conversation, her pulpit, her literature, it is her most frequent and eloquent figure. In Bermuda metaphor, it stands for perfection, perfection absolute. Around one isolated potato barrel stood 4 young gentlemen, 2 black, 2 white, becomingly dressed, each with the head of a slender cane pressed against his teeth, and each with a foot propped up on the barrel. Another young man came up, looked longingly at the barrel, but saw no rest for his foot there, and turned pensively away to seek another barrel. He wandered here and there, but without result. Nobody sat upon a barrel, as is the custom of the idle in other lands. Yet all the isolated barrels were humanly occupied. Whosoever had a foot to spare put it on a barrel, if all the places on it were not already taken. The habits of all peoples are determined by their circumstances. The Bermudians lean upon barrels because of the scarcity of lamp posts. We went ashore and found a novelty of a pleasant nature. There were no hackmen, hacks, or omnibuses on the pier or about it anywhere, and nobody offered his services to us or molested us in any way. I said it was like being in heaven. The Reverend rebukingly and rather pointedly advised me to make the most of it then. The hotel was closed. We knew of a boarding house, Mrs. Kirkham's, but no vehicle to take us or our baggage there. What we needed now was somebody to pilot us to it. Presently a little barefooted colored boy came along, whose raggedness was conspicuously not un-Bermudian. His rear was so marvelously bepatched with colored squares and triangles that one was half persuaded he had got it out of an atlas. When the sun struck him right, he was as good to follow as a lightning bug. We hired him and dropped into his wake. He piloted us through one picturesque street after another, and in due course deposited us where we belonged. He charged nothing for his map, and but a trifle for his services. So the Reverend doubled it. The little chap received the money with a beaming applause in his eye, which plainly said, "This man's an onion." We had brought no letters of introduction. Our names had been misspelled in the passenger list. Nobody knew whether we were honest folk or otherwise. So we were expecting to have a good private time in case there was nothing in our general aspect to close a boarding-house doors against us. We had no trouble. Bermuda has had but little experience of rascals and is not suspicious. We got large, cool, well-lighted rooms on a second floor, overlooking a bloomy display of flowers and flowering scrubscalia and annunciation lilies, lantanas, heliotrope, jasmine, roses, pinks, double geraniums, oleanders, pomegranates, blue morning glories of a great size, and many plants that were unknown to me. The early twilight of a Sunday evening in Hamilton, Bermuda, is an alluring time. There is just enough of a whispering breeze, fragrance of flowers, and sense of repose to raise one's thoughts heavenward, and just enough amateur piano music to keep him reminded of the other place. There are many venerable pianos in Hamilton, and they all play at twilight. Age enlarges and enriches the powers of some musical instruments, notably those of the violin, but it seems to set a piano's teeth on edge. Most of the music in vogue there is the same that those pianos prattled in their innocent infancy, and there is something very pathetic about it when they go over it now in their asthmatic second childhood, dropping a note here and there where a tooth is gone. Was awaked at 6 a.m. Monday by our ambitious young rooster. Looked out, saw him swelling around a yellow cat asleep on the ground. Birds, a bugle, and various noises. Then a piano over the way. The little white table waiter appeared suddenly in my room and shot a single word out of himself. Breakfast. I thought I would make one more effort to get some conversation out of this being. Have you called the Reverend, or are... Yes, sir. Is it early, or is 8:05? Do you have to do all the chores, or is there somebody to give you a colored girl? Is there only one parish in this island, or are there 8? Is the big church on the hill a parish church, or is it Chapel of Ease? Is taxation here classified into pole, parish, town, and don't know? Before I could cudgel another question out of my head, he was below, hand-springing across the backyard. He had slid down the balusters head first. I gave up trying to provoke a discussion with him. The country roads curve and wind hither and thither in the delightfulest way, unfolding pretty surprises at every turn. Billowy masses of oleander that seem to float out from behind distant projections, like the pink cloud banks of sunset. Sudden plunges among cottages and gardens, life and activity, followed by as sudden plunges into the somber twilight and stillness of the woods. Flitting visions of white fortresses and beacon towers pictured against the sky on remote hilltops, glimpses of shining green sea caught for a moment through opening headlands, then lost again, more woods and solitude, and by another turn lays bare, without warning, the full sweep of the inland ocean, enriched with its bars of soft color and graced with its wandering sails. We prowled on for several hours, sometimes by the seaside, sometimes inland, and finally managed to get lost, which is a feat that requires talent in Bermuda. I had on new shoes. They were number 7s when I started, but they were not more than 5s now, and still diminishing. I walked 2 hours in those shoes after that before we reached home. Doubtless I could have the reader's sympathy for the asking. Many people have never had the headache or the toothache, and I am one of those myself, but everybody has worn tight shoes for 2 or 3 hours and known the luxury of taking them off in a retired place and seeing his feet swell up and obscure the firmament. During this day and the next, we took carriage drives about the island and over to the town of St. George's, 15 or 20 miles away. Such hard, excellent roads to drive over are not to be found elsewhere out of Europe. An intelligent young colored man drove us and acted as guide-book. We saw no bugs or reptiles to speak of, and so I was thinking of saying in print, in a general way, that there were none at all. But one night, after I had gone to bed, the Reverend came into my room carrying something and asked, "Is this your boot?" I said it was, and he said he had met a spider going off with it. Next morning he stated that just at dawn the same spider raised his window and was coming in to get a shirt, but saw him and fled. I inquired. Did he get the shirt? No. How did you know it was a shirt he was after? I could see it in his eye. We inquired around, but could hear of no Bermudian spider capable of doing these things. Citizens said that their largest spiders could not more than spread their legs over an ordinary saucer, and that they had always been considered honest. Here was testimony of a clergyman against the testimony of mere worldlings, interested ones, too. On the whole, I judged it best to lock up my things. The island is not large. Somewhere in the interior, a man ahead of us had a very slow horse. I suggested that we had better go by him, but the driver said the man had but a little way to go. I waited to see, wondering how he could know. Presently the man did turn down another road. I asked, "How did you know he would?" "Because I knew the man and where he lived." I asked him satirically if he knew everybody in the island. He answered very simply that he did. This gives a body's mind a good substantial grip on the dimensions of the place. Presently, away out on a country road, Twichell said, "There's a little dog seems lost and is worn out." He belongs to an old man named Yokes, so the driver is acquainted with all the dogs, too. Well, he doesn't need to know many, for dogs are very scarce. However, they make up for it in cats. You may march the country roads in maiden meditation, fancy-free, by field and farm, for no dog will plunge out at you from unsuspected gate, with breathtaking surprise of ferocious bark, notwithstanding it is a Christian land and a civilized. We saw upward of 1,000,000 cats in Bermuda, but the people are very abstemious in the matter of dogs. 2 or 3 nights we prowled the country far and wide, and never once were accosted by a dog. It is a great privilege to visit such a land. Cats were no offense when properly distributed, but when piled, they obstructed travel. Plenty of redcoats and English faces. Cedar is a pretty enough tree, except when it is the prevailing tree. Then it is not so pleasant. In fact, the cedar is so thick everywhere that you almost get the impression that it is the only tree here. Pretty little bird on a wall. Had to stir him up with a whip handle to make him stir. So he stirred a foot and grumbled about it. So we left him there. With all this luxuriance of vegetation, no vine seemed to ever climb these white houses. Perhaps they can't get hold of the smooth, hard coat of whitewash. A country cottage here, with its cozy comfort bedded in among a wealth of brilliant geraniums and other flowers, and the pink oleander, is a mighty pretty thing. In other countries you'd know the cottage was worm-eaten and rotten. Here you know it is as sound as if brand new. Pigs, chickens, cows, horses, goats, donkeys, all anchored out on a hillside grazing. Mighty poor grazing, too. The tidiness, the marvelous cleanliness and neatness of this town and people. No hog wallows, no puddles, no stinks. The whitest and tidiest town in New England is shabby compared to this. Wretched wooden houses on edge of St. George's, villainous contrast to the tidy coral ones. One can't imagine where the poor live in these bewitching cottages. At the principal hotel at St. George's, the Globe Hotel, a young girl with a sweet, serious face said we could not be furnished with dinner because we had not been expected and no preparation had been made. Yet it was still an hour before dinner time. We argued. She yielded not. We supplicated. She was serene. The hotel had not been expecting an inundation of 2 people, and so it seemed that we should have to go home dinnerless. I said we were not very hungry. A fish would do. My little maid answered it was not the market day for fish. Things began to look serious, but presently the boarder who sustained the hotel came in, and when the case was laid before him, he was cheerfully willing to divide. So we had much pleasant chat at table about St. George's chief industry, the repairing of damaged ships, and in between we had a soup that had something in it that seemed to taste like the hereafter, but it proved to be only pepper of a particularly vivacious kind, and we had an iron-clad chicken that was deliciously cooked, but not in the right way. Baking was not the thing to convince this sort. He ought to have been put through a quartz mill until the tuck was taken out of him, and then boiled till he came again. We got a good deal of sport out of him, but not enough sustenance to leave the victory on our side. No matter, we had potatoes and a pie and a sociable good time. Then a ramble through the town, which is a quaint one, with interesting crooked streets and narrow crooked lanes, with here and there a grain of dust. Here, as in Hamilton, the dwellings had Venetian blinds of a very sensible pattern. They were not double shutters, hinged at the side, but a single broad shutter hinged at the top. You push it outward from the bottom and fasten it in any angle required by the sun or desired by yourself. All about the island one sees great white scars on the hill slopes. These are dished spaces where the soil has been scraped off and the coral exposed and glazed with hard whitewash. Some of these are a quarter acre in size. They catch and carry the rainfall to reservoirs, for the wells are few and poor, and there are no natural springs and no brooks. They say that the Bermuda climate is mild and equable, with never any snow or ice, and that one may be very comfortable in spring clothing the year round there. We had delightful and decided summer weather in May, with a flaming sun that permitted the thinnest of raiment, and yet there was a constant breeze. Consequently, we were never discomforted by heat. At 4 or 5 in the afternoon, the mercury began to go down, and then it became necessary to change to thick garments. I went to St. George's in the morning, clothed in the thinnest of linen, and reached home at 5 in the afternoon with 2 overcoats on. The nights are said to be always cool and bracing. We had mosquito nets, and the Reverend said the mosquitoes persecuted him a good deal. I often heard him slapping and banging at these imaginary creatures with as much zeal as if they had been real. There are no mosquitoes in the Bermudas in May. There are several sights in the Bermudas, of course, but they are easily avoided. This is a great advantage. One cannot have it in Europe. Bermuda is the right country for a jaded man to loaf in. There are no harassments. The deep peace and quiet of the country sink into one's body and bones and give his conscience a rest, and chloroform the legion of invisible small devils that are always trying to whitewash his hair. A good many Americans go there about the 1st of March and remain until the early spring weeks have finished their villainies at home. The Bermudians are hoping to soon have telegraphic communication with the world, but even after they shall have acquired this curse, it will still be a good country to go to for a vacation, for there are charming little islets scattered about the enclosed sea where one could live secure from interruption. The telegraph boy would have to come in a boat, and one could easily kill him while he was making his landing. We had spent 4 days in Bermuda, 3 bright ones out of doors and 1 rainy one in the house, we being disappointed about getting a yacht for a sail, and now our furlough was ended, and we entered into the ship again and sailed homeward. It was much the joyousest trip I ever had, not a heartache in it, not a twinge of conscience. I often come to myself out of a reverie and detect an undertone of thought that had been thinking itself without volition of mind. If we'd only had 10 days of those walks and talks instead of 4.